You wake up and for a few brief seconds the world is quiet. No emails, no deadlines, no noise, no pressure. Just a narrow window where your mind has not yet been claimed by anything outside of you. Most people never notice how powerful that moment is, because in reality the direction of your entire day is often decided right there in the first few minutes after you open your eyes. Most people do not lose their day in the afternoon. They lose it before breakfast. The alarm rings, the phone appears, and instantly the mind becomes crowded. Notifications, messages, unfinished thoughts from yesterday, worries about what might go wrong today. Within seconds, the brain is reacting instead of choosing. The day has not even begun, yet their attention already belongs to the world. This is why the first hour matters so much. Not because mornings are magical, but because the mind is most impressionable during that time. The first thing you feed your mind becomes the emotional tone of the entire day. If you feed it chaos, you spend the day reacting. If you feed it clarity, you spend the day directing. The Stoics understood this with remarkable precision. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the Roman Empire, still faced the same battle every morning that you face now. The battle between discipline and comfort, between intention and drift. He once wrote a reminder to himself when he struggled to get out of bed: I rise to do the work of a human being, not the work of someone chasing comfort, not the work of someone waiting for motivation, the work of someone who understands that life is meant to be lived with purpose. The truth is simple. If you do not command the first hour of your day, something else will. Your phone will command it. Your anxiety will command it. Other people's priorities will command it. And once that hour is gone, the rest of the day often feels like recovery instead of progress. But when you win the first hour, something powerful begins to happen. Your mind settles into direction instead of confusion. Your actions start with momentum instead of hesitation. And momentum, once created, becomes one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. One strong hour becomes a strong morning. A strong morning becomes a strong day. And strong days repeated long enough become something far more important: a life lived with intention instead of accident. Most people lose their morning before they even realize it has begun. The alarm sounds, the eyes open, and almost immediately the hand reaches for the phone. A message appears. A notification flashes. A headline demands attention. Within seconds, the mind is no longer quiet. It is reacting. Problems from work enter the room. Other people's expectations enter the room. News, comparison, urgency, and distraction all rush in before your mind has even had a chance to stand on its own. And just like that, the day begins under someone else's control. The Stoics warned about this long before phones existed. They understood that the mind is weakest when it first wakes. It is impressionable, easily influenced, easily pulled in different directions. If you allow the outside world to enter too quickly, your attention becomes scattered before your day has even started. Epictetus taught that the only true authority a person possesses is authority over their own mind. And the moment you wake up is the moment that authority must be reclaimed. Owning your morning means refusing to let the world claim your attention first. It means creating a small barrier between you and everything that wants something from you. No phone for the first few minutes, no outside noise, no rushing into reaction. Instead, you give your mind a moment to stand upright. You breathe. You become aware that a new day has begun. And before anything else enters your awareness, you remind yourself that your mind belongs to you. This practice may seem simple, but its effect is enormous. When you begin the day in silence rather than stimulation, your thoughts become clearer. Your emotions remain steady. You are not immediately pulled into urgency that does not actually belong to you. Instead of reacting to the world, you prepare to meet it. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of mental preparation every morning before facing the responsibilities of ruling an empire. If a Roman emperor needed to claim his mind before the world entered it, then the rest of us probably need to do the same. The difference is subtle but powerful. A person who begins the day in reaction spends hours trying to recover focus. A person who begins the day in control carries that control into everything that follows. And it all begins with one quiet decision. When you wake up, Your mind will belong to you before it belongs to the world. The next discipline of the Stoic morning is this: direct your first thought. The moment you wake up, before you even move, your mind begins speaking. It starts forming interpretations about the day ahead. Sometimes the voice is subtle, sometimes it is loud, but almost everyone hears something similar in those first seconds. I'm tired. This day will be stressful. I don't feel like doing this. I wish I could stay in bed. These thoughts may seem harmless, but they quietly shape the emotional direction of your entire day. The Stoics understood that the mind, especially when it first wakes, is highly impressionable. The first thought you accept becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. If the morning begins with resistance, the rest of the day feels heavier. Small inconveniences feel like proof that the day is already going wrong. Motivation becomes harder to find. Energy feels lower. But if the morning begins with intention, the exact same circumstances are experienced very differently. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to intervene in this moment. Instead of allowing the mind to complain about discomfort, he replaced the first thought with a reminder of purpose. He wrote in his journal that when you wake up and struggle to rise, you should tell yourself that you are rising to do the work of a human being, not the work of someone chasing comfort, but the work of someone choosing to live deliberately. That single shift transforms the relationship you have with the day. Directing your first thought does not mean pretending everything will be easy. Stoicism was never about blind optimism. It was about clarity. It was about recognizing that difficulty will exist, but deciding that your response to it will be guided by discipline rather than emotion. When the mind offers doubt, you replace it with intention. When it offers complaint, you replace it with responsibility. This is the beginning of mental authority. You do not control which thoughts appear first, but you do control which ones you accept and reinforce. When you choose your first thought deliberately, you interrupt the automatic patterns that most people live under without ever noticing. And once you control the opening thought of the day, something powerful begins to happen. Your actions follow that direction. Your mood stabilizes. Your focus strengthens. The day no longer begins with surrender. It begins with command. One of the most powerful Stoic disciplines you can practice in the morning is this: leave yesterday behind. The moment your mind wakes up, it often tries to reach backward. It pulls unfinished conversations into the present. It replays mistakes. It revisits embarrassment, regret, and frustration. Before the day even begins, the mind is already carrying emotional weight from a time that no longer exists. Most people do this automatically without realizing the cost. They begin the morning replaying what they should have said, what they should have done, or how things could have gone differently. But while the mind is trapped in yesterday, today quietly slips away. The Stoics warned about this mental trap. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to confine his attention to the present moment, not because the past had no value, but because clinging to it weakens your ability to act now. Yesterday cannot be edited. It cannot be improved or corrected. The only thing you can influence is what you do next. Yet people often waste enormous energy trying to mentally rewrite events that are permanently finished. This is where the Stoic distinction becomes important. Reflection without rumination. Reflection is useful. It allows you to learn from mistakes and improve your judgment. But rumination is different. Rumination traps you in a loop of criticism and regret. It repeats the same memory over and over without producing growth. Reflection teaches and then releases. Rumination clings and drains your mental strength. Seneca understood this difference clearly. He practiced reviewing his actions each evening, asking himself what he did well and what he could improve. But once the lesson was learned, he did not carry the emotional burden into the next day. The lesson stayed. The regret was discarded. This allowed him to wake up with clarity rather than self-punishment. When you wake up in the morning, ask yourself a simple question: is there something from yesterday that I am still carrying? If there is, take the lesson from it and leave the rest behind. You are not required to drag yesterday's mistakes into today's opportunities. Growth does not come from endless self-criticism. It comes from learning once and then moving forward with greater wisdom. The Stoics believed that every new day is a fresh field for action. The past may inform you, but it should never imprison you. When you release yesterday, your mind becomes lighter, clearer, and far more capable of meeting the day that is actually in front of you. One of the most dangerous moments in the morning is not when you are tired. It is when you hesitate, because hesitation is where doubt begins to grow. The moment you wake up and start negotiating with yourself, your mind begins creating reasons not to act. It sounds harmless at first. Maybe I'll start in 10 minutes. Maybe today can be easier. Maybe I'll wait until I feel more ready. But those small thoughts slowly build resistance. The longer you sit with them, the heavier action begins to feel. The Stoics understood this pattern very well. They believed that hesitation feeds fear. When you delay action, your imagination begins exaggerating the difficulty of what you need to do. A simple task starts to feel overwhelming. A small responsibility begins to look like a major obstacle. And suddenly the hardest part of the day is not the task itself, but the decision to begin. Marcus Aurelius faced this battle every morning. In his private journal, he wrote a reminder to himself when he struggled to get out of bed. He told himself that he was not born to hide under blankets and chase comfort. He was born to act, to fulfill the duties of being human. That reminder broke the cycle of hesitation. Instead of waiting to feel motivated, he moved. This is one of the most powerful lessons of Stoic discipline. Action destroys hesitation faster than thinking ever will. The moment you take the first step, the mental resistance begins to disappear. Your mind shifts from imagining the difficulty to participating in the task. Fear loses its power the moment movement begins. That is why the Stoics valued immediacy. They did not wait for perfect motivation. They did not wait for ideal conditions. They believed in beginning quickly, even if the action was small. Write one sentence, do the first push-up, start the first task, open the first page. Movement creates momentum, and momentum carries you forward. Most people spend the morning negotiating with themselves. Stoic discipline removes that negotiation entirely. You wake up, you act, and you move before doubt has time to grow. Because the truth is simple. Motivation is unreliable. Feelings change constantly, but action creates its own energy. And once you begin moving, the hardest part of the day is already behind you. One of the most powerful Stoic disciplines for the morning is surprisingly simple. Secure one meaningful win early. Before the distractions arrive, before the world begins demanding your attention, complete something that requires effort, something slightly uncomfortable, something that proves to your mind that today will not be a day of drifting. Most people start their day with small, easy tasks. They check messages, they scroll through updates, they answer low-priority emails. These actions feel productive, but they rarely create real momentum. Instead, they scatter attention. By the time the important work appears, the mind is already tired and fragmented. The morning becomes busy but not meaningful. The Stoics approached the day differently. They believed that the morning should begin with intention, not reaction. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to focus on what truly mattered, rather than being pulled toward whatever demanded attention first. He understood that when you confront something difficult early, you gain more than progress. You gain psychological strength. When you complete one challenging action early in the day, you create what could be called an internal victory. It is not about impressing anyone. It is about demonstrating to yourself that you can do what you said you would do. That proof matters. Because confidence is not built from motivational speeches or positive thinking. It is built from evidence. Evidence that you follow through. Evidence that your actions match your intentions. Seneca once wrote that difficulties strengthen the mind the way physical labor strengthens the body. When you deliberately face effort early in the morning, you train your mind to tolerate discomfort. You stop seeing difficulty as something to avoid. Instead, you begin to recognize it as the pathway to growth. This is why the Stoics valued meaningful effort over easy activity. One difficult task completed in the morning changes the emotional tone of the entire day. Instead of carrying the quiet pressure of something unfinished, you move forward with clarity. You have already proven to yourself that resistance does not control your actions. The principle is simple but powerful. Start the day with one action that matters. Write the first page, do the hardest task, complete the work that requires focus and courage. Once that first victory is secured, momentum begins to build. And momentum, once created, becomes one of the strongest forces guiding the rest of your day. One of the greatest enemies of a disciplined morning is scattered attention. The modern world is designed to divide your focus into hundreds of small fragments. Notifications interrupt you. Messages demand replies. News headlines provoke emotional reactions. Social media pulls your curiosity in endless directions. None of these things seem dangerous on their own, but together they create a powerful effect. They drain your mental energy before the day has truly begun. The Stoics understood something that modern science is only beginning to emphasize again: attention is life's most valuable resource. Wherever your attention goes, your energy follows. And wherever your energy flows consistently, your life begins to take shape. If your attention is scattered all morning, your day will feel scattered. If your attention is focused, your day becomes powerful and productive. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to concentrate fully on the task in front of him. He wrote about performing each action with sincerity and complete attention, as if nothing else mattered in that moment. This principle may sound simple, but it requires discipline, because the mind naturally wants to wander. It wants stimulation, it wants novelty, and the modern world offers endless opportunities for distraction. This is why protecting your focus in the morning is so important. When you wake up, your mental energy is at its highest level. Your mind is clearer, your attention is sharper. But if you immediately scatter that attention across dozens of small distractions, you lose the advantage that morning naturally provides. The Stoic approach is different. Instead of doing many things poorly, you choose one thing and do it well. You remove distractions. You silence unnecessary noise. You commit your attention to a single meaningful task. This is the power of single-task focus. Seneca once warned that people who try to be everywhere mentally end up being nowhere in reality. When your mind constantly jumps between tasks, it never fully engages with any of them. The result is exhaustion without progress. But when your attention is concentrated, your work becomes deeper and more effective. Protecting your focus early in the day changes everything. You move through tasks with clarity instead of confusion. You complete meaningful work before the world begins demanding your attention. And most importantly, you train your mind to stay present rather than constantly chasing the next distraction. The Stoics believed that mastery of attention leads to mastery of life. Because once you learn to control where your focus goes, you begin to control where your energy and ultimately your future will follow. Most people misunderstand discipline. They imagine it as restriction, pressure, or the removal of freedom. They believe discipline means saying no to comfort, no to pleasure, and no to the easy path. Because of that, they resist it. They think freedom means doing whatever they feel like doing in the moment. But the Stoics saw something deeper. They believed the opposite was true. Without discipline, a person is not free at all. If your actions are controlled by every passing impulse, you are not leading your life, you are reacting to it. When you wake up and immediately follow whatever your mood tells you, your day becomes unpredictable. If you feel tired, you delay. If you feel distracted, you scroll. If you feel stressed, you escape into comfort. Slowly, without realizing it, your life becomes shaped by temporary emotions rather than deliberate choices. Epictetus understood this better than almost anyone. Before becoming a philosopher, he lived as a slave. Yet later, he taught one of the most powerful ideas in Stoic philosophy. A person who cannot govern themselves will always be controlled by something else. It may not be chains or a master, but it will be impulses, habits, distractions, and fear. This is why morning discipline matters so much. When you wake up and follow through on the actions you promised yourself, getting up when the alarm rings, beginning your work without delay, focusing instead of drifting, you are training something far more important than productivity. You are training self-command. Each disciplined action reinforces the idea that your choices are stronger than your impulses. Over time, these repeated mornings begin to shape your identity. At first, discipline feels like effort. You are forcing yourself to act against comfort. But eventually something changes. You begin to see yourself as someone who shows up, someone who follows through, someone who does what they decided to do. And identity is powerful. Once you believe that you are a disciplined person, your behavior naturally aligns with that belief. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop waiting for motivation. Action becomes part of who you are. That is why the Stoics called discipline the path to freedom. Not the freedom to avoid effort, but the freedom to live according to your principles instead of your impulses. The more control you gain over your own actions, the less control distractions, fear, and comfort have over you. And every morning you practice discipline, you strengthen that freedom a little more. At the end of all these Stoic disciplines, one truth remains: above everything else, you are the author of your day. Most people live as if the opposite were true. They wake up believing the day will be decided by circumstances, by their schedule, their boss, their mood, the weather, the traffic, or the behavior of other people. When things go well, they feel lucky. When things go poorly, they feel powerless. But the Stoics rejected that mindset completely. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that a person's life is shaped not by events, but by their responses to those events. You cannot control everything that happens today. Challenges will appear. People will disappoint you. Plans will change. Unexpected problems will demand your attention. None of that can be fully predicted or avoided. But the Stoics believe that your true power does not come from controlling events. It comes from controlling how you meet them. Every morning you stand at a quiet crossroads. One path leads to reaction. On that path, the world decides your mood, your focus, and your direction. If something frustrating happens, your peace disappears. If someone criticizes you, your confidence fades. Your entire day becomes a series of reactions to whatever appears. The other path leads to intention. On that path, you begin the day with clarity about who you intend to be. You decide how you will respond before the challenges even arrive. You decide that your discipline will not depend on your mood. You decide that your attention will not be controlled by distractions. And most importantly, you decide that your actions will reflect your principles rather than your impulses. Epictetus explained this idea with remarkable simplicity. He said that while you cannot control what happens to you, you always control how you respond. That response is where your power lives. It is the place where character is built. It is the place where a strong life begins. This is why mornings matter so much. Each morning is a blank page. The world may provide the circumstances, but you hold the pen. Your choices determine how the story unfolds. When you wake up with intention, when you direct your mind, when you act with discipline, you begin writing a very different kind of day. And when days like that repeat often enough, they build something far greater than productivity. They build a life shaped not by chance, but by character.